West Papua could access the curriculum of MIT using his handphone. Imagine what kind of a game-changing that will take place. This is my favorite picture. It is not impossible that if we were to spend the money properly and appropriately in the next 10 to 20 years, that the future Steve Jobs will be born in Papua. It is not impossible that the future Warren Buffett will be born in North Sulawesi. It is not impossible for the winner of Nobel Prize in the fields of physics, mathematics, literature, peace, and all the other things will be from Indonesia in the near foreseeable future. Thank you. It is not impossible because a few things are already possible, and I'll talk about it. There's a guy by the name of Anton Suharya who studied in Indonesia and went over to Japan, and he, along with his friends, came up with a game application which is now one of the top 10 most popular game applications in the world. He invented it. Another possibility that became real is a guy by the name of Sehat Sutarja, who only knew how to fix air conditioners 30 years ago, went over to the US and was given the kind of opportunity that he never saw. He is now running a company which generates sales of more than $4 billion per year. That's a lot of donuts. Now guys, think about it. I've talked about the shift of economies whereby Indonesia is going to be well positioned in the year 2020 and 2030. I've talked about the demographics, how we are so advantaged from a demographic standpoint vis-a-vis all the other countries, even in Asia, not to mention in Europe and in the US. I've talked about the vision for Indonesia from three perspectives. That would be the hard infrastructure, the soft infrastructure, and the digital infrastructure. I will end with a couple of adages. First one is an old adage which my parents and many people around me told me, you got to think big, but you do small and do now. As opposed to thinking small, do nothing, do later. And genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. We have gone through a lot of pains. In 1998, we were politically and economically moribund. We were written off by so many people around the world who have written books, articles, and everything that would have told everybody in the world that Indonesia was on the brink of balkanizing. But guess what? Our fiscal portrait is as sexy as ever. Debt to GDP ratio of 26% on a declination to less than 20% in 3 years' time. Monetary portrait with fantastic ability to manage inflationary pressure like no other in Asia. And a fantastic demographic bonus. But we can't spoil it. Last, a long journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Pak Gita. No future without dreams. And I really love your dream about the infrastructure. 150,000 kilometers of road in the next 20 years. Don't we all dream about that in Indonesia? We're going to talk about education. That's one of the points you mentioned as well in the future, one of the key topics. But we will go to our second guest first, who's going to talk about strategy. His key area is strategy. Mr. Subaid Ahmad. He's the Vice Chairman of the Citibank Institutional Clients Group, and member of its Strategic Advisory Board. His strategic business is to help banks to deliver city product offerings to central banks and ministries of finance all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Subaid Ahmad.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was going to say to George, even though I came a few years after you, George, I'm going to use the podium as well to keep you company. I am not the new generation, obviously. But I'm delighted to be here. And I've been listening to a lot of the remarks that have been made so far. And I think the conclusions and all of that are that we live, obviously, in an extremely complex world with increasing challenges, both internal as well as exogenous. Many of them we can control in terms of climate changes, which have impacted the progress and the growth of many, many countries. And as part of the work that I do at Citi, which is really running our business with governments globally as well as with sovereign wealth funds, I see a pretty interesting nexus of the things that we have been talking about and will be talking about this afternoon. First and foremost, I think as I'll talk about some of the recent trends and what we are expecting going forward, to echo some of the comments that have been made already, governments over the last decade have come to the realization that providing a more efficient and transparent way of doing things for their citizens has not become an option anymore. It's a necessity. And some of the recent trends that we are seeing all around the globe, especially in Middle East and North Africa, has put tremendous pressures on governments saying we have to own our own destiny. We have to take control of what we control, and we can't really worry about all the things that we can't control, because the only way for us to address the challenges when they come unexpected is to be in a position to deal with them as best as we can. No different than what we tell our children, no different than what we tell people who seek advice from us at a personal level. So that pressure on governments has become fairly important. Secondly, it's all about competing for capital, because the only way we can achieve the objectives and take control of our own destiny, as Pak Gita mentioned, in terms of the infrastructure needs of Indonesia as kind of a hurdle to the next step, you have to be able to access capital. And one of the comments that George made as one of the most important events in the history of, I'm sorry, this is, one second. We're going to go back here. The date that you mentioned as one of the most important political events, in many ways was a very important date for how capital started becoming allocated on a global market space. And we have seen that in our own experiences in countries, because the same way that companies do. And some of the basis for being able to access that capital became no different than how companies access capital, which is to differentiate themselves from their competition, take care of risk management, improve their operations, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of interesting things have been happening, and obviously what we're going to try to touch for the next 15, 20 minutes, which is not a simple task, is to try to bring all of that in the context of how it impacts Indonesia. Just a quick thing on Citi, and it's really a segue to what we're going to talk about in terms of this framework that our economists have created to look at who are going to be the real drivers of future growth. We sit with a very interesting perch, which is being on the ground in 109 countries. In many of those countries, we have been operating for over 100 years. Indonesia, we have been for over 40 years. But as significantly, because of that presence and because of the increasing level of activity in many of the so-called emerging markets, our exposure to those markets in terms of where we generate our revenues and make money has increased tremendously as well. So almost half of our business today comes from what we call emerging markets. What's been happening over the last several years is that, the firm initially started with working with US and European multinationals going east and really providing them with on-the-ground services as they expanded their operations in many parts of the world. Over the last 5 to 10 years, that process has reversed. I mean, yes, we have European and US multinationals still trying to expand, but now you have the emergence of what we call emerging market champions, companies from China, companies from India, companies from Korea and Japan, who are actually expanding westwards. And our ability to service those clients in these markets has become as important as what we were doing for the developed market clients. In fact, it has become so important that Citi now has China desks in 10 different countries, which include places like Sao Paulo, Johannesburg, and most recently Algiers, Algeria, where we have Mandarin-speaking people on the ground to support the operations of Chinese SOEs in these countries. So it's fascinating how we are having to evolve our own business structure to really support our clients as they progress in different parts of the world. Clearly, a big part of these discussions is, given all the things that we have been talking about, all of these challenges, all of these complexities in the marketplace, where do we invest capital for growth? Where are we going to be able to differentiate ourselves at a company level to support the shareholder valuation, et cetera, that we are trying to achieve? So we get constantly asked, where should we be putting our capital? How should we be managing it? What are the best markets? What are the markets to avoid? And in a similar fashion, countries, as I mentioned, are trying to position themselves to compete for this global capital from these people, the companies who are seeking to invest, both corporates as well as financial investors. And so we spend a lot of time trying to support and help our clients in that regard. As part of this exercise about a year ago, and I was part of this group at the firm, we started saying, look, you have all of these different acronyms, BRICS, emerging markets and developed markets. In the case of the Eurozone, we are lovingly calling it submerging markets right now. Are those the right ways of looking at things as we look forward and try to advise our clients in terms of how to deploy their capital? And through that process, we came up with a new framework, which is comprised of many, many different factors, many of which we have discussed today, whether it's education, whether it's the political system, whether it's infrastructure, et cetera, which are really drivers of future growth. And instead of looking at it as a near-term concept, we have said, look, we have to look 5, 10, 20, 40, 50 years ahead of us and say, over the long run, because it's a given, as many people have said, based on some of the factors we have talked about and the forecast that we have done, the economy, the world economy, as I mentioned, is expected to grow 5-fold over the next 40 years. And a big part of that, will be translated into per capita GDP growth at the country level. Just looking at why we feel confident in terms of some of these forecasts, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about this concept of convergence. Even despite the significant growth in China, George made a number of comments in terms of where China is today. My point on that is I have to compare it with where China was 10 or 20 years ago, whether that's a good barometer of where China is going to go over the next 10, 20 years, because clearly there's still a very massive amount of the population which is poor, but what that compares to what they were 10 or 20 years ago was even more, and the pace of that growth has been incredible. And despite that, what this chart shows is on the left and the right, what countries' average GDP per capita have been as compared to the US GDP per capita. And you have seen over the last 30 years or 40 years a significant convergence in terms of a number of countries really increasing their overall position in comparison to US per capita GDP. On the right side, we see some of the emerging economies. So you can look at China. Even though China has increased it significantly, and if you look at it from 2000 to 2010, the trajectory has been massive in terms of going from about $5,000 or $6,000 GDP per capita to almost 5 to 6% of where the US GDP per capita was to almost 20% of where GDP per capita for the US is. And despite that growth, they are obviously significantly behind where the US is. And so the ability to catch up and converge with where the US is significant. In the case of India, it's even less. It's only at 10% of where the US is, despite the significant increases in their economic performance over the last 10, 20 years. The flip side of it, which someone said, you have to be optimistic, but you have to also make sure that things don't go the other way. Here are some examples of countries which have either stayed at the levels that they have been over the last 50 years, and they include countries like Hungary and Poland and Cambodia. Someone mentioned Cambodia, Argentina, and Brazil. And on the right side, a number of countries, because of difficult political transitions or the choices that have been made by these countries, have actually significantly reduced their catch-up with the US, and they've gone in a different direction. For example, Venezuela in the